The Son of Buz by Harriet Beecher Stowe. At Rye Beach, during our summer vacation, there came, as there always will to seaside visitors, 2 or 3 cold, chilly, rainy days when the skies that long had not been rained a drop seemed suddenly to bethink themselves of their remissness, and to pour down water, not by drops, but by pailfuls. The chilly wind blew and whistled, the water dashed along the ground and careered in foamy rills along the roadside, and the bushes bent beneath with the constant flood. It was plain that there was to be no sea bathing on such a day, no walks, no rides, and so, shivering and drying our blanket shells close about us, we sat down at the window to watch the storm outside. The rose bushes under the window hung dripping under their load of moisture, each spray shredding a constant shower on the spray below it. On one of these lower sprays, under the perpetual drip, what should we see but a poor little hummingbird, drawn up into the tiniest shivering ball and clinging with a desperate grasp to his uncomfortable perch. A hummingbird we knew him to be at once, though his feathers were so matted and glued down by the rain that he looked not much bigger than a honey-bee, and different as possible from the smart, pert, airy little character that we had so often seen flirting with the flowers. He was evidently a hummingbird in adversity, and whether he ever would hum again looked at as exceedingly doubtful. Immediately, however, we sent out to have him taken in. When the friendly hand seized him, he gave a little faint, watery squeak, and evidently thinking his last hour had come, and that grim death was about to carry him off to the land of dead birds, what a time we had reviving him, holding the little wet thing in a warm hollow of our hands, and feeling him shiver and palpitate. His eyes were fast closed, his tiny claws, which looked slender as cobwebs, were knotted close to his body, and it was long before one could feel the least motion in them. Finally, to our great joy, we felt a brisk little kick, and then a flutter of wings, and then a determined peck on the beak, which showed that there was a sonic bird left in him yet, and that he meant at any rate to find out where he was. Unclosing our hands a little small space, out popped the little head with a pair of round brilliant eyes. Then we bethought ourselves of feeding him, and forthwith prepared him a glass of sugar and water, a drop of which we held to his bill. After turning his head attentively, like a bird who knew that he was about and didn't mean to be chaffed, he briskly put out a long, flexible tongue, slightly forked at the end, and licked off the comfortable beverage with great relish. Immediately he was pronounced out of danger by the small humane society which had undertaken the charge of his restoration, and we began to cast about for getting him a settled establishment in our apartment. I gave up my work-box to him for a sleeping room, and it was medically ordered that he should take a nap. So he filled the box with cotton, and was formally put to bed, with a folded cambric handkerchief round his neck, to keep him from beating his wings. Out of his white wrappings he looked forth green and grave as any judge, with his bright round eyes, like a bird of discretion. He seemed to understand what was being done to him, and resigned himself sensibly to go to sleep. The box was covered with a sheet of paper, perforated with holes for purposes of ventilation, for even hummingbirds have a little pair of lungs, and need their own little portion of air to fill them, so that they may make bright scarlet little drops of blood to keep life burning in their tiny bodies. Our bird's lungs manufactured brilliant flood, as we found out by experience, for in his first nap he contrived to nestle himself into the cotton of which his bed was made, to get more of it than he needed into his long bill. We pulled it out as carefully as we could, but there came out of his bill 2 round, bright scarlet little drops of blood. Our chief medical authority looked grave, pronounced improbable hemorrhage from the lungs, and gave him over at once. We, less scientific, declared that we had only cut his little tongue by drawing out the filaments of cotton, and we would do well enough in time, as it afterward appeared he did. For that day there was no more bleeding. In the course of the second day he began to take short flights about the room, though he seemed to prefer to return to us, perching on our fingers, or heads, or shoulders, and sometimes choosing to sit in this way for half an hour at a time. These great giants, he seemed to say to himself, are not bad people after all. They have a comfortable way about them. How nicely they dried and warmed me. Truly a bird might do worse than to live with them. So he made up his mind to form a fourth in the little company of three that usually sat and read, worked and sketched in that apartment, and we christened him the Son of Buz. He became individually a character whose little doings formed a part of every letter, and some extracts from these will show that some of the little ways were. Hum has learned to sit upon my finger, and eat his sugar and water out of the teaspoon, with most Christian-like decorum. He has but one weakness. He will occasionally jump into the spoon and sit in his sugar water, and then appear to wonder where it goes to. His plumage is in rather drabbled state, owing to these performances. I have sketched him as he sat today on a bit of spirea which I brought in for him. When absorbed in reflection, he sits with his bill straight up in the air, as I have drawn him. Mr. A. reads Macaulay to us, and you should see the wise air with which, perched on Jimmy's thumb, he cocked his head, now one side and then the other, apparently listened with the most critical attention. His confidence in us seemed unbounded. He lets us stroke his head, smooth his feathers, without a flutter, and is never better pleased than when sitting, and he has been doing all this while on my hand, turning up his bill and watching my face with great edification. I just have been having a sort of maternal struggle to make him go to bed in his box, but he evidently considered himself sufficiently convalescent to make a stand for his rights as a bird, and so scratched indignantly out of his wrappings, set himself up to roost on the edge of the box, with an air worthy of a turkey at the very least. Having brought in a lamp, he has opened his eyes round and wide, and sits cocking his little head at me reflectively. When the weather cleared away, and the sun came out bright, Hum became entirely well, and seemed resolved to take the measure of his new life with us. Our windows were closed in the lower part of the sash by frames with mosquito gaze, so that the sun and air found free admission, and yet our little rover could not pass out. On the first sunny day he took an exact survey of our apartment from ceiling to floor, humming about, examining every point with his bill, all the crevices, moldings, each little indentation of the bedpost, each window pane, each chair and stand, as it were very simply furnished seaside apartment. His scrutiny was soon finished. We wondered at first what was all about, but in watching him more closely, we found that he was actively engaged in getting his living by darting out his long tongue hither and thither, and drawing in all the tiny flies and insects which in the summer time are to be found in an apartment. In short, we found that through the nectar of flowers was his dessert, yet he had his roast beef and mutton chop to look after, and that his bright brilliant blood was not made of the simple vegetarian diet. Very shrewd and keen he was, too, in measuring the size of insects before he attempted to swallow them. The smallest class were whisked off with lightning speed, but about larger ones he would sometimes wheel and hum for some minutes, darting hither and thither and surveying them warily, and if satisfied that they could be carried, we would come down with a quick central dart which would finish the unfortunate at a snap. The larger flies seemed to irritate him, especially when they initiated to him that his plumage was sugary, by settling on his wings and tail, when he would lay about him spitefully, wielding his bill like a sword, a grasshopper that strayed in, and who was sunning himself in the window seat, gave him great discomposure. Evidently considered him an intruder, and seemed to long to make a dive at him. But a characteristic prudence confined himself to his threatening movements, which did not exactly hit. He saw evidently that he could not swallow him whole, and that might ensure from trying him piecemeal. He wisely forebode to essay. Had his own favorite places and perches. On the first day he chose for this nightly roost a towel line which had been drawn across the corner over the washstand, where every night established himself with one claw in the edge of the towel and the other clasping the line, and ruffling up his feathers till he stood like a little chestnut burr. He would resign himself to the soundest sleep. He did not tuck his head under his wing, but seemed to sink in down between his shoulders, with his bill almost straight up in the air. One evening one of us, going to use the towel, jarred the line, and soon after found that had been thrown from his perch, and he was hanging head downward, fast asleep, still clinging to the line. Another evening, being discomposed by somebody coming to the towel line, after he had settled himself, he fluttered out, but so sleepy that he had no discretion to poise himself again, and was found clinging like a little bunch of green floss silk to the mosquito netting of the window. A day after, we brought in a large green bow and put it over the looking-glass. Noticed it before it had in their 5 minutes, flew to it, and began a regular survey, perching now here, now there, till he seemed to find a twig that exactly suited him, and after he roosted there every night. Who does not see in this change all the signs of reflection and reason that are shown by us in thinking over our circumstances and trying to better them? He seemed to say, in so many words, that towel line is an unsafe place for a bird. I get frightened and wake up from bad dreams to find myself head downward, so I will find a better roost on this twig. When our little Jenny one day put a clean white muslin gown embellished with red sprigs, flew towards her, with his bill made instant examination of these new appearances, and one day, being very affectionately disposed, perched himself on her shoulder, and sat some time. On another occasion, while Mr. A was reading, established himself on the top of his head, just over the middle of his forehead, in the precise place where our young bells had been lately worn stuffed hummingbirds, making him look as if dressed out for a party. Most favorite perch was the back of a great rocking chair, which, being covered by a tidy, gave some hold into which he could catch his little claws. There he would sit, balancing himself cleverly, if its occupant chose to swing to and fro, and seemingly to be listening to the conversation or reading. Had his different moods, like human beings. On cold, cloudy, gray days, he appeared to be somewhat depressed in spirits. Hummed less about the room, sat humped up with his feathers ruffled, looking as much like a bird in a great coat as possible. But hot and sunny days, every feather sleeked itself down, and his little body looked natty and trim, his head alert, his eyes bright, and it was impossible to come near him for his agility. Then let mosquitoes and little flies look about him. Snapped them up without mercy, and seemed to be all over the ceiling for a moment, resisting all our efforts at any personal familiarity with a saucy alacrity. Had his established institutions in our room, the chief of which was a tumbler with a little sugar and water mixed in it, and a spoon laid across, one of which he helped himself whenever he felt in the mood, sitting on the edge of the tumbler, dipping in his long bill, and lapping with his little forked tongue like a kitten. When he found his spoon accidentally dry, he would stoop over and dip his bill in the water in the tumbler, which caused the prophecy on the part of some of his guardians, and he would fall in some day to be drowned, for which reason it was agreed to keep only an inch of depth of the fluid at the bottom of the tumbler. A wise precaution was proved, for the next morning I was awakened, not by the usual hum over my head, but by a sharp little flutter, and found Mr. Hum beating his wings in the tumbler, having actually tumbled in during his energetic efforts to get in his morning coffee before I was awake. Hum seemed perfectly happy and satisfied in his quarters, but one day when the door was left open, he made a dart out, and into the open sunshine. Then, to be sure, we thought we had lost him. We took the mosquito netting out of all the windows, and setting his tumbler of sugar and water in a conspicuous place, went about our usual occupations. We saw him joyous and brisk among the honeysuckles outside the window, and it was gravely predicted that he would return no more. But at dinner time he came home, as familiar as possible. He sat down to his spoon as if nothing had happened. Instantly we closed our windows and had him secure once more. At another time I was going to ride to the Atlantic House, about a mile from my boarding house. I left all secure, as I suppose, at home, while gathering moss on the walls there. I was surprised by a little green hummingbird flying familiarly towards my face and humming above my head. I called out. He was Hum's very brother. But on returning home, I saw the door of the room was open, and Hum was gone. Now certainly we gave him up for lost. I sat down to painting, and in a few minutes in flew Hum, and settled on the edge of my tumbler in a social, confidential way, which seemed to say, "Oh, you've gotten back then." After taking his usual drink of sugar and water, he began to fly about the ceiling as usual. We gladly shut him in. When our 5 weeks at the seaside were up, it was time to go home. We had great questionings. What was to be done with Hum? To get him home with us was our desire. Whoever heard of hummingbird traveling by railroad? Great were the consultings. A little basket of Indian work was filled up with cambric handkerchiefs, and a bottle of sugar and water provided, and we started with him for a day's journey. When we arrived at night, the first care was to see what had become of Hum, who had not been looked at since we fed him with sugar and water in Boston. We found him alive and well, but so dead asleep that we could not wake him to roost. So we put him to bed in a toilet cushion, and arranged his tumbler for morning. The next day we found him alive and humming, exploring the room and pictures, perching now here and now there, as the weather was chilly. He sat for the most part of the time in a humped-up state, on the tip of a pair of stag's horns. We moved him to a more sunny apartment, but alas, the equinoctial storm came on, and there was no sun to be had for days. Hum was blue. The pleasant seaside days were over. His room was lonely. The pleasant three that had enlivened the apartment at Rye no longer came in and out. Evidently he was lonesome, and gave way to depression. One chilly morning he managed again to fall into his tumbler, and wet himself through. Notwithstanding warm bathings and tender nursings, the poor little fellow seemed to get diphtheria, or something quite as bad for hummingbirds. We carried him to a neighboring sunny parlor, where ivy embowers all the walls and the sun lies all day. There he revived a little, and danced up and down, perched on a green spray that was wreathed across the breast of a psyche, and looked then like a little flitting soul returning to his rest. Towards evening he drooped, and, having been nursed and warmed and cared for, he was put to sleep on a green twig laid on the piano. In that sleep the little head drooped and nodded, fell, and little Hum went where other bright dreams go, to the land of hereafter. And that's the end of Hum, the Son of Buz by Harriet Beecher Stowe. I like that story. I was actually able to finish it because it wasn't too long, wasn't too monotonous, wasn't too boring, wasn't too much to handle. Yeah, I thought that was a good story. The other story I was reading the other day about like Thanksgiving, that was like, it was about like the original Thanksgiving, but that's not what the original Thanksgiving was like. At least this was like a more whimsical story. I give this story 2 thumbs up. I liked it. Thank you for watching. Please let me know in the comments below, what did you think of the story. Please subscribe to this channel to be part of the community, and please like this video. It really helps the channel out a lot. Thank you for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.